The video about variables explained that research variables are either manipulated or measured. The general idea of measurement probably makes sense, but it can get a little tricky when we're thinking about psychological variables. We can't just use a ruler or a measuring cup to measure personality, for example. Between that and the fact that every study includes at least one measured variable, it's important to understand the options for measuring variables. The technical definition of quantitative measurement is the assignment of scores to individuals so the scores represent some characteristic of the individuals. Thinking about the levels of measurement described in the Reading in the Research Methods in Psychology book might help you think about the different ways we can measure a variable and therefore the possible operational definitions. For example, some variables have scores that only represent a category. They don't represent a variation in the quantity of something. We might use the number 1 to represent students and the number 2 to represent non-students, but that doesn't mean that non-students are greater than students or anything like that. In research, we say the measurement is on the nominal scale when the scores are just used to represent different categories. When a score is on the nominal scale, different scores that indicates participants are categorized differently, but that's all the score means. In other cases, the score indicates that there's a difference, but not how much of a difference, like the first, second, and third place finishes in a race. First is fastest, but the difference between first and second might not be the same as between second and third. Ranks in the military or law enforcement are also examples of measures like this, which are called ordinal because they put things in order. The way we think about measurement in day-to-day life is probably more like the interval or ratio scale. We know that 1 cup is the same as 2 half cups, $4 is the same as $2 times 2, and 20 minutes is twice as long as 10 minutes. In other words, there's the same difference between each value on the scale. With an interval scale, the score has meaning in terms of the order and in terms of the amount of difference between the values. Variables measured on the interval scale don't have a true zero, though. We say a variable is measured on the ratio scale when it has a true zero. The difference between interval and ratio is whether it's possible to have a true zero. The main example that's used to illustrate the difference is temperature. Whether we're measuring in degrees Fahrenheit or Celsius, the scale has a 0. But it's not a true 0 because it's not the absence of temperature. In contrast, we can have no water, no time, or no money. They're all measured on the ratio scale. When we're thinking about quantitative variables, we can generally group the approaches to measurement into 3 categories: physiological, self-report, and observation, which is sometimes referred to as motor responses or behavior. I have a feeling the ideas are pretty straightforward, but want to make sure to highlight one thing. When we're talking about measurement, we're talking about specific processes and procedures. It means that self-report measurement is different than a casual conversation or even a questionnaire on the internet. Similarly, observation is different than people watching. If a researcher doesn't consistently use a specific process and procedure to determine the scores, we really don't know what their research is measuring. As the authors of the Research Methods in Psychology book emphasize, researchers in psychology don't approach measurement lightly. There are actually entire research studies with the sole purpose of making sure a measure is consistent and accurate. The technical terms are reliable and valid. The study I used in the example for conceptual definitions and operational definitions is also an example of a type of work that researchers do to make sure measures are accurate. Some psychologists actually spend their entire careers studying psychological measures. That subfield of psychology is called psychometrics. There are a few ways we can think about the consistency of a measurement instrument or tool. One is whether it's consistent over time, assuming whatever's being measured should be consistent. That's referred to as test-retest reliability, because if someone takes a test and then takes the test again later, they're retested, the scores should be very similar. The different parts of a measure should also be consistent, which is called internal consistency. For example, a self-report measure frequently asks several questions about the same thing. There might be a slight variation in the responses, but if they vary substantially for everyone, the measure probably isn't very reliable. When a variable is measured with observation, the score assigned for the same situation should be the same regardless of who assigns the score. That's called the inter-rater reliability. This study might be a helpful example to help you understand what using an observational measure entails and the process of confirming inter-rater reliability. You can stop the recording to read the abstract if you'd like. Basically, the participants were couples, and one member of the couple had to complete a stressful task. The researchers videotaped the couple's interactions before and after the study to measure coping in their conversations. These excerpts from the article explain the operational definition of coping. The first part of the sentence at the top means that a researcher had already developed a list of things to look for when observing behavior. The second part of that section means that they looked for 9 types of behavior, 5 forms of stress expression, and 4 forms of coping that take place when 2 people interact. The section towards the bottom of this slide explains the specific process. For each 10-second portion of the video, an observer decided whether or not the 9 types of behavior were demonstrated. One member of the research team focused on the woman's behavior, and another member of the team focused on the man's behavior. The part about 10% of the tapes being recoded by independent observers means that they checked to make sure observers were consistent in the way they coded behavior. Specifically, they had a second person code 10% of the videos and made sure 2 people could code the same behavior the same way. In other words, they established inter-rater reliability. When a measure is reliable, then we also want to make sure it's accurately measuring what we want to measure. If it's not reliable, it might be measuring something different for each person. Like with reliability, there are a few ways we can think about validity. One thing that's important to keep in mind is that the one that seems the most obvious, face validity, it's not actually as important as it might seem. If face validity is whether a measurement appears to measure what it's intended to measure. There are actually many measures that have high levels of other forms of validity, but don't appear to have face validity. We could also make the argument that sometimes face validity actually makes responses lower in other forms of validity if the person responding is concerned about what the responses might say about them. But I'm getting a bit ahead of myself. The other forms of validity are concerned with what's being measured and whether the measurement's consistent with the measures of the same concept, which is criterion validity, and also different from measures of different concepts, called discriminant validity. I emphasized that I was referring to quantitative measurement at the beginning of this video, but what about qualitative measurement? When we're talking about quantitative measurement, we're talking about the process of assigning scores, but we've already said that qualitative research doesn't use numerical scores. That means the scales of measurement can't be used to describe a measure, but qualitative researchers do collect data. The examples in this slide are a few of the more common approaches. You might have noticed that there's some overlap. Both qualitative and quantitative research can use observation and self-report. When qualitative researchers use self-report approaches, though, it often takes the form of an interview or a focus group rather than a survey. Qualitative studies also use a number of other approaches of collecting data that are quite a bit more diverse than the approaches used in quantitative research. For example, they might gather images of a particular group of people at a particular point in time to gather data about the experiences of that group. Producers of research are concerned with measurement because it's directly related to the credibility of the findings. If quantitative measurements aren't reliable and valid, then the related conclusions are substantially less credible. If qualitative researchers don't use an approach that generates data about the topic they're interested in, they could waste a lot of time. As consumers of research, we want to know that there's evidence the measures were reliable and valid or related to the topic of interest. That's why we see information like in the examples about inter-rater reliability. One of the questions a savvy skeptic asks is, do the measurements seem valid? In other words, are they actually talking about what they say they're talking about?